Some of these friends are not like the others. Our panelists today are Dr. Vic Parati and Dr. Sean Hansen. A 16-year veteran of RIT's Saunders College, Dr. Vic Parati is an associate professor who currently leads the MIS, Marketing, and Digital Business area. During his career, he has directed interdisciplinary research projects funded by the National Science Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and the Kauffman Foundation, among others. He has been awarded RIT's highest teaching awards. His research centers on business implications of new technologies, including digital business, digital entrepreneurship, future internet architectures, web business models, and mobile work. Dr. Sean Hansen has joined the Saunders College faculty in 2010 as an assistant professor of management information systems. His research interests include the areas of agile software development, requirements engineering, IT strategy, Web 2.0 technologies, and the application of contemporary cognitive theory to information systems development. His research has been published in several leading information systems journals, including MIS Quarterly, Decision Sciences, Information Systems Journals, and Information and Organization. Take it away, Sean and Vic.
Welcome, everybody.
Awesome. Happy lunch hour.
Yes. Just to quickly go through our agenda, it'll pop up in a second. We're going to first discuss a little bit about the ubiquity of networks, the fact that we're surrounded that social networks are increasingly embedded within our lives in multiple ways. We'll move on to the question of whether or not we are exceeding our limits as human beings, as individuals and groups, in terms of those networks. A little bit about how networks grow, and again, relating that back to the question of limitations that might be placed on those. Then we're going to discuss a little bit about how we are moving from a state of scarcity to a state of surplus with regard to data in general, specifically based on the growth of those social networks. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about the growth and management of both group networks or organizational networks and individual networks. So that was me. You'll learn to discern us based on our voices. I think we sound different enough. Vic will take over here.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. I hope you're eating lunch while you watch this. I'm guessing that many of you are working with other networks while you listen to Sean and I in the background. This is fun for us. We're broadcasting right out of the picturesque Dean's Conference Room at the Saunders College of Business. So this is a fun first experiment for the webinar. I like to begin talks like this one by reminding everyone that we're in a very special moment in time, and I think it's very easy to forget about that. I like the way that an author named Kevin Kelly says it. He says, "This is amazing, and we're not amazed." And what's amazing is the way that an incredible array of technologies has come into our lives and totally disrupted our daily activities, disrupted industries, disrupted governments, disrupted a lot of the things that are happening. And this has come within the last 15 years. And so our experiences today are in many ways very different than those of our parents, than those of our grandparents. And for me, they're different from how it was when I was an undergraduate. You alumni, some of whom I definitely recognized in our list of attendees, have watched some of this happen too. So, today Sean and I are going to reflect. We're going to have I like to call it a jazz-like performance, thinking about the way all of this has changed a number of things, and beginning with a conversation about networks. So I began to reflect on the ubiquity of social networks, and this originated years ago. Professor Neil Hare and I gave a talk entitled Ubiquitous Social Networks, and really it's an acknowledgement that social networks have become so important that they follow you everywhere. So, for example, if we flip it around, you might think about how could you get away from your social networks? Where would you go to get away from them? Certainly, you know that there are bathroom users of social media. Hopefully somebody's laughing at that, but heck, it's no secret. You can read posts like that all the time. You don't have to work very hard about it. You need only watch the latest automobile commercials to see people using social media from the comfort of their car.
Hopefully hands-free.
Hopefully hands-free. I like the commercial where the guy goes on a date, and then just after the date, he's playing back his Facebook feed and hearing how well the date went in retrospect in social media. You can't go to the movies. The movies have become very much interested in this phenomenon. I have a picture there of the Facebook movie. You don't get to 500 million friends without making a few enemies. I have a great image that I didn't share with you of during a power outage in New York City, everybody running to the plugs for charging their cell phones so they can stay in touch with their social media friends. It is really a radically different world than we have come from. These networks, social networks and other networks, have become a really default way that we communicate, probably the dominant way that we communicate. In terms of total usage, social networks passed email years ago, 5 years ago, in terms of the total usage. One of the things that I think is funny is social media has become one of the key things that our astronauts do to stay connected. This guy submits pictures back to Earth in his Twitter feed from the space station. There's a recent one from Boston. He took a picture of Boston just after the unfortunate events that happened there. So you can't even go to space and get away from social media. It's everywhere. And that's just one element in the different networks that we want to consider. I want to quickly, before we change to the next slide, say a word about the title. The subtitle is "Some of these friends are not like the others," and I think you gathered from Sean's ideas in the agenda. I feel like, and I think others feel like, we have sort of begun to cross a boundary where it's getting to be a little too much in a number of ways, a little too many friends, a little too present in our lives. And so we're at a moment where we may begin to think about the other side. It may become a real question, is there a place where I can get away from all this communication? And that's what we're going to reflect on over the next few minutes. Let's hit up the next slide. So one thing to reflect on is Facebook is dominant. This is some data from the Pew Internet Research Group showing that about 67% of the people in their most recent poll are active users of social media. And you can see some of the active demographics there. But Twitter is popular, Pinterest is popular, Instagram is popular, Tumblr is popular. People are using more and more different kinds of networks, and this is just the beginning. I was chatting with my digital entrepreneurship class a few minutes ago and asking them, how many profiles do you maintain? Sean, how many profiles do you maintain online?
That's a good question. I don't know, 3 or 4?
I had students say as high as 30, 50. It's one thing, of course, to sign up and join a community, and it's quite another to sort of manage these relationships going forward. So it's something to reflect on. This sort of multiplies the demands of the network over time. I think it's interesting.
Well, and I do want to also call attention in this little graphic. I think something worth calling attention to is the services especially appealing to column. Now, I think Facebook is fairly widely adopted by many, but in some of the other social platforms, you do see some self-selection, some different groups. I know I've posed the question to my own classes about which platforms they use, and if you pose the question of whether or not you use Pinterest, the men will not say they use it. Even if they do, they won't be caught admitting it,
right?
Because there is a certain gender association with that particular social network. And so what you do see in this data and others is that there may be people gravitating towards certain social networks based on their real-world social groups.
I like that, and it does take me back to where I wanted to go. I mean, some of these friends are not like the others means in a sense that in joining networks, we, I think, kind of got excited and started friending everybody or accepting all friend requests. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. Some of the people in the room look like it sounds familiar to them. And maybe that's not the right approach, or maybe we need to find ways to deal with the situation where we don't want to be connected to everybody in exactly the same way. And we'll talk about that nuance going forward. I'm ready. Let's see what the next slide looks like. Oh, yeah.
Robin Dunbar.
Go ahead.
So this is Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar, if you were to Google him, you might run into him being referred to as a social media guru because he has called attention to some of the possible limits around social media, but he's actually an evolutionary psychologist. And this number of 150 is something that has turned up in a number of his studies and those of other colleagues. Broadly, it has sort of set a certain paradigm within evolutionary psychology that says 150 seems to be a number, a cap on the human capacity for developing and maintaining social groups. And this is based, again, on the research that's been done on this covers a very broad context, let's say.
Yeah.
So certainly looking at, in some of Dunbar's original work, he looked at who do you send Christmas cards to, and he's a British scientist, and he studied the British population about who's sending out Christmas cards or annual holiday cards, and the number seemed to gravitate toward about 150. It was a little higher in that case. But then looking at hunter-gatherer groups, they all tend to get to about a number not exceeding 150, so traditional hunter-gatherer groups. Even in organizations, certain organizations, when they are not hierarchically structured, once they get to about 150, they tend to split. So there's this number that pops up in all these different environments of social interaction, and the way Dunbar actually captures it is to say that 150, you can think of it as the number of people that you would not feel embarrassed about simply joining uninvited for a drink if you were to run into them at the bar, which I think is kind of an interesting way, because we can all put ourselves in that sort of position where if I spotted somebody and I recognized them, how many of those people would I just walk up to and say, you know, can we share a drink? You want to share a drink? That kind of thing.
I think the neat question is how applicable is Dunbar today? So there's widespread understanding that, you know, we're headed towards some kind of limit. Certainly my tolerance for some of my Facebook friends is rapidly waning. We're hitting some kind of limit there. But there may be more profound things going on. Dunbar's work initially with the greeting cards was a decade ago. Yeah. And some of the modern social networks like Path is limiting people to 150 connections based on this Dunbar number business. So I think it's a very interesting question. Are we really at some kind of limit of human beings, or do all these new technologies extend our capabilities in some interesting way?
Well, and let me make one additional point there. With regard to this number, it's based on empirical observation of groups, but it's also based on brain science. So the argument that you get from Dunbar and other evolutionary psychologists is that this is not simply something that we tend to do, but it might be a limitation of our cognitive capacity as individuals. And so then the question is, what implication does that have for the creation and management of social networks in an internet fashion?
I think limits are an interesting theme that we could spend more time with, but we won't due to our time restriction. Think about Twitter's limit of 140 characters, which really defined what Twitter was all about and made it the popular thing that it is today. It's based on, I think, a deep insight that people don't want to consume long-form status messages, and so instead they consume short things in Twitter. That limit is very good for Twitter, might be good in general, and may very well be connected to the cognitive capability of people. Let's turn one more slide.
People leaving.
Yeah, if we look a little deeper into the Pew Internet research, there's lots of reasons why people choose to take a break, a multi-week break from their social networks, from Facebook in particular. but the number that fascinates me in this table is the 61%. Almost two-thirds of people report having a serious break in their social media usage, and that's just another indicator, I think, that, you know, we're getting saturated with all these messages that we're receiving.
Well, and there is a question of sustainability. Sustainability not in sort of an ecological sense as we frequently talk about today, but sustainability in terms of what are the behaviors that we can sustain over the long term. And I think most of the discussion that we see is about continual growth of social networking platforms. But I know from my own experience, which obviously is anecdotal, that my participation certainly waxes and wanes with regard to social networking platforms. And I think a lot of us probably have had that experience. And then the question is how are these sustainable over the long run? And if we start looking at these channels as key mechanisms for getting business done, which we'll talk about momentarily, are there implications for sustainability of these as business practices, as business channels?
I think that's actually a nice segue into the next slide. Let's think for a minute about how networks grow, because networks in general are businesses. The idea is that we discover somehow how to make some profit off of the huge number of users that become connected to our social network. So if I'm creating a social network, I'm going to try to get as big a user base as possible, and what that means is I'm going to make it as convenient as possible for people to get connected. And it's very easy to see that in any social network that you look at. Facebook's Add Friend button, you can see everywhere you look. It's very easy to add a friend. It's just one click away. Boom, you're connected. LinkedIn has made it easier than ever to hit a plus sign and get connected to somebody. Follow is a link in Twitter, and it's just that easy. If we reflect on the opposite for a minute, you'll realize that it's much more difficult, particularly where we started, to shrink your network or control who sees things in your network or manage your security. So in terms of the user interface, there is a deep embedded preference for growing networks rather than shrinking or managing networks. And I do feel like that's had a profound impact on the way these things have gone. It works well to support a business model. It may not work well to support individuals in communication, and so that's a trade-off that we experience.
Well, and I think there's sort of a question of social pressures and social stigma here as well. Maybe not stigma, but I think many of us, you know, you'll use the social networking platforms and we identify people that we haven't seen in 20 years and we think, oh, I remember that person, so you add them, but you're much less likely to delete. You know, I think we have good evidence that says these networks do tend to grow, but then they don't shrink again. And then that raises the question of do we need to have easier ways of shrinking, or do we want to exercise easier ways of shrinking? Because we might just not, we might feel bad hiding or deleting a friend on Facebook or another social media platform just because it seems like a slight that we're
I think there is an absolute social stigma associated with defriending somebody, and in this day and age, it has become easy to sort of just screen them completely out of your feed. So if they're writing 50 posts a day, you don't have to see it. That's something that I have learned to manage very well. I want to point out one more thing at the bottom of the slide. Embedded in these social networks are a set of algorithms that do very interesting things, and we don't reflect on them very often. In fact, Sean and I have had this conversation outside of this presentation. These algorithms have a lot to do with our experience of social networks. So on the one hand, I have a little picture there. They recommend who we might like to follow from Twitter, from Facebook, or from other social networks. Somehow, they're deciding that these people are a good match to who we are and who we are already connected with. But that's based on some computer making that decision for us. And that could be a good recommendation. It could be a bad recommendation. But I am very much convinced that it has a lot to do with how our networks grow, and specifically whom is added to our networks. The other place you see it, incidentally, is in deciding whose stuff is most represented in your news feed. So I see information, I have lots of contacts, and I see information from some of them, a lot more than others, and Facebook's newsfeed algorithm is in the background making decisions about that.
And that actually, I think, leads us to this, the next topic, which is, or the next facet, which is this question of filter bubbles, which is a phrase that comes from a political activist by the name of Eli Pariser. I'm not sure, actually, that that's how you pronounce his last name.
Me neither.
But that's what it looks like to me.
Sorry, Eli.
But he's a fairly prominent gent, again, in certain political circles. But he has coined this phrase, filter bubble, because he raises the point about that in the use of social media, and actually the internet in general, we're increasingly being shown information that the masters of the internet, that those developing the search engines and the social media platforms think is what we want to see. And they think that's what we want to see based on our past behavior. The issue is that this personalization, this act of web personalization, are presenting us things that the algorithmic gatekeepers, to use Pariser's phrase, determine is what we want, isn't really a matter of our control. So that once the algorithm decides you want to see one thing and not the other, you're not going to get the opportunity to see the other. You see what's sort of appropriate, what they deem to be appropriate for you. And that raises a fairly substantial ethical question at a societal level, which is if we see only what we already agree with or what we tend to like and never are faced with things that might contradict our perspectives or introduce a new thought or different perspective into our worldview, are we really becoming isolated from one another in various ways? And there's lots of evidence that suggests that we are seeing this sort of societal isolation. Straightforward evidence, just like increasing polarization in our political spectrum. There's a reason why Fox News and MSNBC are the two most popular cable news networks. No slight to anyone on the call who might work for CNN. It's just based on my review of the numbers. But the reason that those two are the most popular is that they tend to speak to one side of the political spectrum or the other. And so what you have is people essentially seeking out environments that tell them what they've already heard. But from a societal perspective is that the existence of those types of filter bubbles where even without our choice we tend to see only one side of the story, does that create a dysfunctional social dynamic?
I think absolutely, and hearing the same thing over and over again can be boring. It may make us less interested in using these services for a longer term or more often. We're going to make sort of a radical transition here and talk about some of the outcomes of all this social media. We use it at a record pace. It is, as I've said, the dominant form of communication. And the one thing that we can be sure of is there is a digital trail left behind. In many ways, that digital trail, like the communication, is beyond the abilities of people to manage. But the emergence of this big data concept I think really centers around our capabilities extended by the computing, now using technology as an enabler, to wrap our minds around all of the amazing things that are happening and summarizing them, visualizing them, looking for trends in them, and that is developing new kinds of understanding that never have been possible before.
Can I make one point? Sorry, Vic.
I don't know.
To my mind, if I can clear my throat, perhaps I can. To my mind, it's not a radical turn because the previous concept of filter bubbles and the issue of big data both turn on the same question, which is a question of complexity. That with the rise of social media and multiple platforms and multiple profiles, 30-plus profiles that people might be managing, we have increased complexity. And I think the developers of those algorithmic mechanisms that create the potential phenomenon of a filter bubble are intended as responses to complexity, helping us address complexity by showing us things that they deem are most relevant for us. And the same issue arises here, that we see with the explosion of social media platforms and other types of information technologies that we have the emergence of this phenomenon that's broadly called big data. And it's not a phrase that I'm particularly a fan of.
Agreed.
Because it's not very descriptive, right? And it's not descriptive for a reason. It's this idea of we get data sets. We now encounter data sets that are so large and so diverse that we almost don't know what to do with them, right? That they exceed the processing capacity with which we used to deal with large amounts of data, which was conventional database technologies. And so you'll see various quantifiers placed on this: terabytes of data, petabytes of data, exabytes of data, things like that. But there's no sort of definitive guideline. It's just this idea of big data, right?
Yep.
And I think what we want to call attention to is that it's actually these social media platforms that are one of the significant drivers of that big data phenomenon. And we call it a big data phenomenon, but it's both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is, how do we make sense out of it, right? The opportunity is if we can make sense out of it. And that applies to both data generated from a social stream as well as from other, again, information technology.
I think, let's head to the next slide. I think the opportunity is pretty profound. You see people like Nate Silver correctly predicting the presidential election, including almost every state, or every state in this case. There are changes in the way that sports are happening, in part because of the ability to analyze the players in new and unprecedented ways. This slide reflects on how quickly this is happening to us, or maybe at the accelerating pace at which this is happening to us. So I began with, Kevin Kelly. This is amazing, and we're not amazed. This is astounding what's happening to us as we live and breathe. I mean, every day, huge amounts of data are appearing. And I love the statistic: 90% of the data in the world today is created in the last 2 years. Astounding. This is very, very different than where we were just a few days ago.
Well, and again, the question that I think it poses is, when do we hit our limit, right? When do we as human beings hit a limit? I remember just as a young man or child hearing statistics, something to that effect, that it wasn't 90%, right? At the time, it was some significant percentage of information or knowledge that's just generated within the last 5 or 10 years. But the number of years keeps shrinking, and the percentage keeps going up, right? So that we're now at this point where 90% of the data in the world has been generated within the last 2 years. And again, as the quote states, a lot of that is driven by social media. So a number of the things cited here: posts on social media sites, digital pictures and video, purchase, well, not so much the purchase transactions, but certainly the cell phone GPS signals. All of those relate to the contemporary phenomenon of social media, which is becoming more mobile in nature. And so it's driving this explosion of data, and that poses, again, to my earlier comment, that presents an opportunity. Because there was a time when data was scarce, right? The primary objective of an organization was, how do we get our hands on more data? The classic comment from every MBA, soon-to-be graduating MBA, when they do a case analysis, their classic resolution always involves at least one recommendation, something to the effect of, well, we need to do more research. We need to gather additional data. I think the insight we're getting now is we can get as much data as we want. Data is no longer scarce. Insight is still scarce. And so the question then becomes, how do we glean insight from this wave of data that's washing over us?
It becomes much more a selection process. There is such a mass of data, it becomes very difficult even to choose which subset of this mass of data you want to address. One way we do this is through visualization, which is the next slide.
Yeah, this is, to me, one of the really promising domains in terms of trying to make sense out of massive amounts of data. And as I'll show you in a second, specifically data coming from social media is one of these domains where we can really actually get some insight through some advanced visualization techniques. If anyone's particularly interested, obviously in the context of this short discussion, we can't go into a great deal of depth, but if anyone's interested in some of the explosion or the new insights coming from data visualization. We could certainly provide some names. Some of the names that come to mind, Edward Tufte is sort of the godfather of this stuff. Hans Rosling, a number of really good TED Talks if anyone's interested in that. David McCandless is another guy who's done some really pioneering work in this regard. One of the points, though, is that if we're trying to really get insight from data, data visualization can get us a long way, but it has to do certain things in order for us to actually get knowledge out of those visualizations. And some of the things that we call attention to here, it has to be data that actually enables comparison. Numbers become relevant to us when compared with other numbers. So we have to have visualizations that enable that comparison, give us some idea about causality, what's causing what within the data being presented, and also ensuring that we're seeing data in context. These are principles that can largely be derived from Tufte's work, but pretty important as we move forward in terms of managing data from social networks and other sources, that we have to be able to see what's the data, the data in context, so that we're not just so that we're making more informed decisions.
Yep.
Now, can we go to the next slide real quick?
Yeah, we better.
So this is an example that I love. We had initially intended possibly going to the web and showing you a little bit of this. So we've included the URL at the bottom of the screen. But this is a little data visualization that was done by the New York Times based on Twitter feeds during the Super Bowl a couple of years back. Steelers, Cardinals, I think that was 2009. Does it say 2009? Yep. Yeah, 2009. The Super Bowl. And it's a very fun visualization. I've used it in class a number of times. So in a couple of seconds, you can see you can get immediate insight flowing from the Twitter streams that were occurring during the Super Bowl. Insights as far as all things that were being tweeted, frequency of tweets or volume of tweets in different areas. You get a sense of geography. In this particular example, I did the talking about ads thread and played through it and picked Rochester to see what we were talking about here in Rochester at that particular time. You see most of the country was talking about career builder. But again, this is about getting insight from that social media stream. So for example, if you spend a couple $1 million for 30 seconds of airtime during the Super Bowl, I think it's pretty insightful to get a sense from social media of how interesting or how interested your viewers were in what you had to say. Career Builder was one very strong example. But to me, this kind of visualization where you're taking large amounts of data and summarizing it in a very concise way is much more insightful than when the news program will say so-and-so is just tweeted this comment. That's right. Cherry picking. Absolutely. Giving big sets of information.
No, I'm going to make a quick remark and then we'll keep moving. One is that visualization, I think where we're coming from is produced by an expert and is sort of a static thing. And we're heading to an area, I think, of consumer, citizen, user-generated data visualizations. You'll have your hands on the data, you'll have your hands on the tools, and you'll be able to explore dynamically data sets rather than seeing the result of somebody else's work, which is pretty cool. I think Nate Silver, the New York Times statistician, in part was successful because he visualized well. He allowed people to understand a very detailed algorithm, again, through a visual of the United States in a map.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Let's touch the sort of now thinking about take-home messages or ideas going forward.
Yeah, so we're realizing we're running a little behind, so we'll try to pick up the pace a touch. But I think what we've walked through is some of the aspects of the phenomenon broadly of social media and the growth of social media, aspects sort of positive and negative, the things that we see interesting as sort of challenging the way we do things as a society and as business, as managers. Again, being at a business school here, we do frequently sort of ask the question of how does this impact the world of business. But we also want to looking forward, what are the key trends that we see going out? And here's a couple that we want to touch upon. The first is we use the phrase Facebook inside, but it's really not Facebook anymore. We're seeing the growth certainly of internal social media platforms within organizations. So a lot of organizations, I like the quote from Ryan Holmes, who's the CEO at Hootsuite, which is a social media aggregator, aggregation service, dashboard service, that says we're finally, seeing social media make the jump from the dorm room to the bedroom. So that it really is starting to impact the way we do business, and organizations have taken that insight and started to create a number of internal social media platforms, or you might refer to these as social software suites that integrate social networking functionality, email, instant messaging, collaboration platforms, wikis, all of that into a single platform. So I think we'll continue to see the growth of that in the coming years. We are also seeing that this functionality is moving beyond the marketing department. Traditionally, this is something where marketing saw a lot of promise, but the applications elsewhere was an open question, and we're now starting to see a number of these other groups adopting this social media functionality to enhance their own productivity. One of the things I like to call attention to is that this is largely a return to knowledge management. In the 1990s, the phrase of knowledge management was very popular. It was, you might call it a management catchphrase, but it was stemmed from this old idea. Someone at Hewlett-Packard had posed the question of, how great it would be if only HP knew what HP knows, with the idea being that how can the organization tap into the knowledge of its individuals? And I think what we're seeing with social media platforms and social software suites is a return to that question with new solutions of mechanisms for organizations to tap into that base of knowledge and to make sure people within the organization can access others within the organization who have the expertise that might be needed on a given project or a given endeavor. I think we're also starting to see the quote from Holmes at the top of the screen, the C-suite within organizations is starting to realize that social media is probably not something that can be done ad hoc, right? That we really need to craft some strategies and understand specifically how the organization is going to use social media, why it's going to use social media, and also deciding on outcome measures, what the metrics are going to be, because you can only manage what you can measure. So with regard to social media, that becomes a key question for us.
That feels a little overdue to me, just saying.
I think you're absolutely right. And the last piece is that we're starting to see an expansion of formal educational programs around social media. So certainly we're very proud of here the fact that we've integrated this into a number of our programs, new media marketing probably being the one with the most obvious focus on this, but certainly within MIS and a number of our other programs. And actually, not just here in the Saunders College of Business, but across campus, I think we're seeing a lot of our educational programs at RIT that focus on the application of social media and how it can be managed going forward. And I think you're going to see continual growth of that as institutions of higher education learn that this is not a social phenomenon that's going away, and we've got to learn how to do it in a concerted and rigorous manner.
Awesome. I think the way to bring it home now is to go back to the level of the individual, which is more or less where we began. The implication for people, I think, is fairly profound and still evolving. It is certainly the case that defriending somebody has always had kind of a social stigma to it. That's the most obvious way to shrink your network. You just cut the connection. Based on user feedback, social networking companies like Facebook have begun to develop alternatives to doing that. For example, the ability to control your news feed, I think, is better than ever in Facebook. The same is true in Twitter. We're getting more and more nuanced tools as users demand more and more nuanced tools to control the information that we see. And that allows us to manage different kinds of friends, right? The people that I'm really close to, I can see their stuff every day or every hour if they post it, and the people that I'm less close to, I'll see less frequently. So it's working with the algorithms that are built into these programs and giving the user more input into that process. But in the meantime, we have collectively developed strategies like developing multiple profiles. Many of my colleagues have a profile that's more professional and a profile that's more personal or family-oriented. That's possible. An insight that goes along with that, I think, is the idea that each of these is a kind of identity that we're projecting into a different environment. We have our employer-friendly identity, we have our family-friendly identity, and that's something that's likely to continue going forward.
But I do think, Vic, actually, if we could just discuss briefly on that concept, I think that's also a challenge when we look at social media platforms, because in regular social situations, human beings are pretty good at maintaining multiple identities. We don't like to think so. We like to think we're one person from start to finish. But in reality, we speak to our friends in very different ways than we speak to our colleagues at work. We speak to our family members, as I learned when I came home for Thanksgiving the first time when I was an undergraduate, I realized I had to clean up my language pretty quickly because my mother wasn't going to go for that. My dad was okay with it, but my mother wasn't going to go for the way I talked to my friends at college, right? But we learn how to maintain those different identities as human beings. The question is, in an online world, can we maintain those boundaries in the same way? And I think it's something, I know I have struggled with this. I think a lot of people have struggled with this. Maintaining boundaries in a social media environment is very different than the way we do it as human beings in a traditional social environment.
Yep. If I reflect on what a lot of people have said to me, even this morning, it's that they often modify their identity for reasons other than you might think. It's too much of a pain to manage multiple profiles, so I'm just not going to put anything on there that anybody might object to. And that's a little bit sad, I think. We have tools that enable us to communicate in amazing new ways, and we don't use them because it's not convenient. The tools are not yet ready to allow us to have these, deep and different kinds of relationships that we want to have or that we have already.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question.
So do we simply filter ourselves?
I submit that we do.
Yeah.
There are many tools out there that make this very interesting. I think about Hootsuite or TweetDeck that allow you to manage multiple accounts at the same time. But I love the tool called Quitter that allows you to track down who it was that stopped following you on Twitter. That's fascinating to me. This is available on Facebook too.
Social media vendettas can only be the next step.
For people that are very interested in these networks, that is a really important point of information. It's public information. It's not a secret that, so-and-so defriended me, but I might not discover it in the wash of all the information that I have on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Now there are additional tools that will allow me to do that if I care about that. For many of us, probably that's not that important. Sally, take us home.
So thank you, Sean and Vic, for your thoughts on managing social networks. We do have some questions that I'd like to get right to. We do have a question from Mary, and she wants to know, what can you do about filter bubbles?
Well, that's a good question, because the challenge is, if the filter bubble phenomenon is legitimate, there's not much you can do. You can do some things like deleting cookies, and if you delete some of your web history and things like that, part of the personalization mechanisms are driven by those tools. So cookies, I think most people are familiar with. It's basically small pieces of code that are placed on your machine that shows your past search history and your past web activity. And if you get rid of that, you're essentially coming to the web anew, not entirely, because the platforms also maintain some of that history. But it can help to eliminate some of that filtering bias. But the broader question is, without knowing what the algorithms are, and a number of these, again, the algorithmic gatekeepers, to use Paris's phrase, it's hard to know how to address it, because there's a certain extent to which you might say it's happening behind our back. I don't mean that in sort of a malicious intent way, but it's not something that's before us so that we can take action to address it.
I think, the challenge is to be a truly educated person. You can't rely on whatever it is that Facebook thinks you want to see. You're going to have to be very active in pursuing your knowledge. That may mean you don't only read the Atlantic Monthly, you read something else. You read The Economist, you read the Wall Street Journal. You watch Fox as well as CNN to get different perspectives.
And actually, to this point, and I think this actually brings us back to some of what we're doing here at RIT now, is I also think it raises the premium on critical thinking. That, as many of you may know, critical thinking is a big area of focus for the university, for the institute, going forward. But I really see critical thinking as the new literacy, right? So literacy still matters. Literacy and numeracy still matter. But to me, the winners and losers in the social media age and in the internet age are going to increasingly people who can look at an argument and break it down and discern to what degree they should accept it, and whether or not the people making such an argument are providing evidence to support it. So the study of critical thinking and engendering critical thinking in the next generation of youth and young adults, I think, is absolutely critical from a societal perspective.
Yep. I think part of the literacy is understanding this very concept, that there are filter bubbles, that there are algorithms in the background making decisions for you. We use that word literacy a lot. It could mean programming literacy in this day and age. It could be the ability to create media. There are new kinds of literacy that are relevant today that were never relevant before. I wholeheartedly agree with Sean. Critical thinking and pursuing diverse viewpoints is the challenge that we all face today. Certainly the opportunity is there to do that, though, with all the information that surrounds us.
We have another great question from Dave. How do you get the 50-plus generation to cross the chasm to social networks, given that they don't know the language and the tools of social media? There is a large chasm from the dorm. There is a large chasm from the dorm room to the baby boomers.
I hear this all the time, many times. Sometimes I'll joke about the answer to this question. Have you seen the interface for Twitter? I'll describe it to you. To the left is a text box, and to the right is a button. It's fairly straightforward. The nuance, the learning that has to happen to participate is not how to use the tools. They are so intuitive. The learning that has to happen is the cultural dynamics in these networks. It is, what does RT, MT mean? What have people done with these tools to make Twitter a useful place? How are people using Facebook? Is it okay to private message somebody? You wouldn't know that if you're not an active user of the tool, but you can easily figure out how to do it. I would like to suggest, Dave, wherever you are, that you hire one of our outstanding RIT alumni to help you with this situation. In fact, the people that ask me this question most frequently are people looking for a 20-year-old to come in and help them with some of the network dynamics in social media. Failing that, if you don't like that answer, there are many ways to learn, but the best one is simply to practice. Spend some time in a community, find somebody that you admire in a community, and watch what they do.
Well, and I would also say, and this is sort of me trying to exercise the critical thinking that I try and tell my students to exercise. I'm not certain, you know, I would probably have to do a little digging to have the numbers in my fingertips, but I'm not certain that the chasm is quite as large as you perceive it to be. You know, I do know the Pew Internet and American Life project that Vic referenced a second ago. I know some of the data from there says that we have now reached a point where more than half of all adults over the age of 65 are actively online. I don't know that that's specific to social media platforms, but are online and engaging in Internet-based activities on a regular basis. So that I think we may be seeing that chasm closing on its own. One of the things that I love when I talk to my students is, you know, they love phrases like, well, our generation believes the following. Our generation is the Internet generation. You know, that kind of thing. And I like to point out to them whenever that statement comes up, I says, I pose the question, what's the average Facebook user? It's not an 18-year-old man or woman. It's not a 22-year-old man or woman. The average Facebook user is a 35-year-old man, I think, was at the last time I looked at the numbers. And so I wanted to say, like it or not, guys, the average Facebook user looks a lot more like me than like you guys.
Right.
That was 5 years ago, though, so now I'm over the average. But
the pace, the point in part is that the pace of change is so much quicker than a generation. We're all in it together. The 18-year-olds today and the 46-year-olds today are all experiencing this together at the same time because it's happened like that. It's crazy. Yes, they have grown up with it. Yes, they got access to it earlier in life, but we're all experiencing it together.
Yeah, this is a phrase that I know one of my former colleagues uses the phrase of digital natives, that there is definitely a reality in the fact that younger adults are digital natives. They have been born and bred in a digital environment. And that does give certain sensibilities and certain perspectives that maybe those of us who are digital immigrants don't have. I think sometimes digital immigrants might have some lessons to teach in the
Sure.
opposite direction, but I think we have to recognize that there are lessons going in both directions there.
Cool. Another one?
We have time for one last question, and Melissa would like to know, if the human brain inherently limits us to 150 social connections, does that mean that there is no point to maintaining networks larger than that? And what is the implication?
I think it's an interesting question, you know, of whether or not the human brain, if we concede that the human brain limits us in that regard, then the conclusion might be, oh, well, then there's nothing we can do about it. But in reality, when we look at information technology, we have in so many ways expanded or built upon the capacity of the human brain. And I think we might see the same thing here, right? So in the discussion we had of big data and visualization, the human brain wouldn't have been able to make sense out of a lot of that Twitter stream in the New York Times example. There's no individual on earth who could have made sense out of that. And yet, through the use of some technology, we were able to actually consolidate it, present it in a concise and easily digestible fashion, and actually get some insight. And I think I'm a firm believer that technology can hold. You know, I don't want to be deterministic and assume that it will, but can hold promise for helping us take advantage, you know, expand upon our abilities. And also, I do think that 150 is for close social relationships. But there's no reason to believe that we can't have social networks and just acknowledge that not all those people are going to be people we're going to be willing to approach for a beer when we see them sometime, or approach to share lunch together or something like that.
Yep, I think that's hitting the nail right on the head for what I was thinking. I mean, that research was based on people mailing Christmas cards. It is a totally different technology today. Because of the technology, goodness knows how many people I'm connected to, but it's well more than 150. And I like to think I do an okay job, you know, staying connected with these people in different ways. These networks have enabled us to have a new kind of power, I think. It's extended our limits. And probably the deepest way goes right back to the subtitle. I want to deal with some friends in different ways than others. And these networks are beginning to allow me to do that in a way that I'm comfortable with. They're not there yet. It's a challenge still. But at the same time, I feel like I'm not limited to 150, not even close. Maybe the number of close friends that I can maintain is much smaller.
But that point you make about different types of friends, and again, our subtitle suggests it, I think that's the real question going forward, is how do we establish and maintain various types of boundaries? I have one little story which I find amusing because of my tendency towards self-deprecation. But I went to a Halloween party a number of years ago. And I was in a group, and we were going as the Flintstones, and I was Betty Rubble. Now, I thought it was funny. My friends thought it was funny. But my sister-in-law posted the picture on Facebook, and all of a sudden I thought I would have no problem sharing that picture with any of my friends. I'm not sure I want my dissertation advisor to see that picture, right? And that kind of boundary setting and boundary blurring is, I think, the real challenge posed by the current technology, and the solutions to that are going to be critical, I think, for us going forward.
Feel free to write in if you'd like to see that picture.
I don't have it.
Message to Sally.
It was her picture.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions today. Thank you, both Vic and Sean, for being our distinguished panelists today. And to all of our RIT alumni who joined us in this lively discussion. Please note that our next webinar is scheduled for May 23rd, and our presenter will be lecturer Mike Johansson, talking about how social media is changing industry and how you can capitalize on that change.